Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the World Resources Institute, I want to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on climate federalism. My name is Dan Lashoff, and I have the honor of serving as WRI's U.S. Director. So thanks for joining us. I'll start with a few opening remarks and then turn it over to my colleagues and our great panel. When President Trump announced his intention to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement on June 1st, 2017, a remarkable coalition of state, local, and private sector leaders stepped up to say, we are still in, and their leadership has really made a difference as we have seen US emissions of climate-altering pollution continue to fall over the last 3 years, even as the federal administration has done everything in its power to reverse the policies of the Obama administration. And even in the face of COVID, we've seen continued leadership and progress. A report issued last month by the America's Pledge group that WRI participates in showed that the leadership is still on track to make substantial emission reductions by 2030 in all of the sectors that we surveyed. But we also know that that progress is not fast enough to meet the demands of science. So as we anticipate a possible new switch in the direction of federal policy over the next several months, the question is, what role can these leaders play? What role should states and cities in particular play in a situation where the federal government is also pursuing ambitious climate policies? To answer that question, or at least to shed light on it, WRI convened the new Climate Federalism Dialogue, which brings together thought leaders from several key states and cities, regional leaders and think tanks, and former federal officials to discuss the optimal roles of federal, state, and local government in meeting the climate challenge. And this isn't an academic exercise. Climate federalism is, or federalism broadly, is certainly well studied, but we wanted to delve into specifics. And this question comes up when talking about the full set of potential climate policies, whether it's carbon pricing, a clean energy standard, resilience planning, vehicle emission standards, and investments in low carbon transportation systems. The group that we got together, provided both thought leadership and will play an active role in influencing how the federal government advances policy. And our goal is to be thoughtful about that and really drive a positive partnership. So today we're releasing our report that has come out of that dialogue on climate federalism. We'll begin the webinar with a brief presentation of the report's findings by my colleague Devashree Saha. And then after that, we'll turn to a great panel discussion with three of our participants from that dialogue. Nicholas Bianco will moderate a panel featuring Secretary Theo Hardees from Massachusetts, Jeremy Tarr from North Carolina, and Chris Castro from Orlando. So just before turning it over to Devashree, I'll note we are using the Zoom webinar feature, so your mics are muted, but we encourage you to participate by asking questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom taskbar, and we will have a Q&A session after the presentations. So with that, let me turn it over to Devashree.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. As Dan mentioned, I'll be walking you through the key findings of our report, New Climate Federalism, which we have released today. So, as you all know, addressing climate change effectively is going to require largely decarbonizing the US economy by mid-century. So pretty much every sector of our economy will require a mix of policy solutions to get to our desired goal. And in doing so, sustained action at every level of government, federal, state, and local, is going to be critical. Next slide, please. So in talking about federalism and what ought to be the optimal role for each level of government, we oftentimes present arguments for and against strong federal or strong subnational efforts. Sometimes we say that the federal government ought to be in the driver's seat as it can provide a level playing field, or it can help achieve economies of scale. At other times, we say, let's give preeminence to subnational role because that can help foster policy innovation and experimentation. Actually, all of these arguments are right. Just like in the past, energy and environmental policies have frequently involved the sharing of responsibility. Going forward too, addressing climate change is going to require cooperative action. Next slide, please. So the deployment of electric vehicles in the country is a perfect example of that cooperative approach. The adoption of EVs has been supported by both federal tax credit as well as a whole slew of state and local incentives and taxes or free exemptions. Moving forward, any future federal program which aims to support the deployment of zero-emission vehicles is going to depend on state and local support for the rollout of charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. So what does our paper, which we released today, highlight in terms of how should federal policymakers allocate roles between federal, state, and local governments? And just like Dan mentioned earlier, this is not just an academic exercise. We are perhaps at a point in time where we may see the possibility of federal re-engagement on climate policy. So the question of what are the respective strengths of each level of government and what each can bring to the table becomes really important to address now. Next slide, please. So our report offers 9 principles that can guide federal policymakers and US action on climate change. These principles were developed over the course of 2 convenings with our group of state, local, and federal thought leaders. And while the participants have not signed onto these principles do reflect their insight on how to delineate federal, state, and local roles in a manner that is most effective for any particular circumstance. So with that said, our first principle says that ambitious federal action is necessary, but the urgency and scale of climate change requires that all levels of government must be part of the solution. So on this point, let's hear from Reed Schuler, Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Jay Inslee, Washington State.
In the state of Washington, under Governor Jay Inslee's leadership, we set limits in statute to cut greenhouse gas emissions roughly in half by 2030 and achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We're already working hard to meet our goals with policies like our 100% clean electricity law, our phase down of super polluting HFCs, our commercial building performance standard, and our new zero emission vehicle law. But there's plenty of road ahead in the long fight against climate change. Now we need the federal government to step up and set ambitious science-based reduction targets and do everything it possibly can to achieve those targets. When leadership returns at the national level, they're going to have strong partners in the form of states across the country. And even when that happens, states are still going to have a serious role to play in helping our country to do more. Leadership states like Washington want a federal floor for action, not a ceiling. We're not going to rest until we've won this fight.
Moving on, African Americans are 75% more likely than white people to live in fence-line communities. Minority and poorer communities are disproportionately affected by air pollution relative to the overall population, with African Americans facing the highest impact. The implications of all this should be clear to all of us. Policies at every level should promote equitable and healthier outcomes for all Americans, especially disproportionately harmed communities of color and low-income communities. Lucia Athens, Austin's Chief Sustainability Officer, has more to say on this in our next slide.
People of color and low-income communities are disproportionately affected by extreme heat, increased flooding, wildfires, and poor air quality. Their homes and their health are more at risk from climate disruptions, and they lack the financial resources to be able to respond and recover. Climate policy is needed now to mitigate these disparate impacts and to create more resilient communities. We need leadership to ensure that the benefits of new jobs, lower energy bills, and clean air are distributed equitably so that everyone benefits. That is why equity is a central pillar of climate planning here in Austin, Texas. In early September, we released our draft climate equity plan. We took extra steps to develop this plan with extensive participation from communities of color and underrepresented voices from across our city. This plan uses equity as a cross-cutting principle to ensure that the plan's benefits reach the communities where they are needed most. In Austin, we work with these communities every day. Local government is uniquely positioned to tailor and administer programs to ensure that no one is left behind. Federal policymakers should follow the lead of places like Austin, working with city and local government to tackle these challenges together.
A second key principle that our report focuses on is that the best way to achieve consistency in regulations across the country is to establish federal standards that are sufficiently ambitious to address the climate challenge while preserving the ability of state and local governments to take even more ambitious action. What this means is that preemption should be rare. The federal government should enable and not impede more ambitious actions by state and local government. The current debate around vehicle emission standard is a good example here. Under the prior administration, leading states were happy to harmonize their standards with the federal standards as they were viewed to be sufficiently ambitious. That sentiment largely disappeared, however, the moment this administration worked to roll the standards back. Next slide, please. Another principle that the group supported is the acknowledgement of the critical role played by subnational governments as laboratories of democracy that can not only help pioneer new solutions, but also spur market development in a manner that can help enable more ambitious federal policies over time. Going forward too, the federal government should learn from, engage with state and local governments, and replicate successful policies at the national level where appropriate. Sarah Cottrell-Propst, Cabinet Secretary of the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department in New Mexico, has more to say on this in our next video.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cottrell-Propst, Cabinet Secretary of the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. New Mexico is committed to meeting the climate challenge head on, And as one of the country's largest oil and gas producing states that's also committed to climate action, we've proposed the most comprehensive emission standards for oil and gas operations in the country. New Mexico can go far on its own, but our state's leadership is no substitute for a strong national policy framework. States and local governments should work in partnership to ensure good outcomes for all communities. Consider New Mexico's Energy Transition Act, which will decarbonize the state's electricity grid by 2050. This law includes critical provisions to make sure communities and workers have transition assistance, and these solutions must reflect local needs and aspirations. That's why we believe that state and local engagement is crucial to any national climate strategy.
There's broad agreement that some policy situations will warrant a strong federal role. US participation and leadership in international cooperation, for instance, will be really necessary to show leadership and also drive action at the global level. Another example is programs to drive R&D of new technologies, which calls for strong federal action because they require large financial investments. They need significant expertise or resources that are generally not available to most state and local governments. So this slide sort of lists the areas where a strong federal role is necessary. Next slide, please. In a similar fashion, there are going to be some areas that warrant a strong state and local role. Transportation infrastructure policy comes to mind here. State and local governments are most knowledgeable about the transportation investment needs of their communities. They also exercise authority over land use and other infrastructure development decisions. So given all that, it seems reasonable to say that a stronger state and local government role is appropriate in some instances. Mark Chambers, director of New York City's Office of Sustainability, explains this in our next video.
Our climate is in crisis. The only way we confront that truth is with focused leadership from all levels of government. That leadership starts with local governments like ours here in New York City, working closely with residents to understand their real-life challenges and craft community-driven solutions that meet people where they are. It's why we passed landmark legislation that will drastically cut emissions from our buildings. It's why we're focused on confronting social inequality and investing in young people in frontline communities to create good-paying jobs, all as a part of our transition away from fossil fuels. But let's be clear, this is an existential crisis, an emergency that will continue to shock every industry and every household. And cities can't tackle it on their own. We need the federal government to stand with us. We need urgent action at an unprecedented scale. Whether you call it a Green New Deal or call it whatever you want, we must cut greenhouse gas emissions in half in 10 years, period. The road before us will be hard. There will be resistance, there will be hotter summers and more fires and more floods, but you know just as I do that we can do more. We can be better. We can meet this moment and this crisis head on. Cities, states, and the federal government united in a common cause. Stand with us.
In the great majority of cases, however, a collaborative approach is going to work best. Three specific areas that the group discussed were clean energy standards, carbon pricing programs, and zero emission vehicle standards. Obviously, there could be many other areas which would benefit from this kind of collaborative approach. But given that these three policy options are being currently discussed in the policy and political world as potential federal response to addressing climate change, the dialogue focused on these three cases. We will hear more about the respective roles of the federal, state, and local governments in implementing these three policy options in our panel discussion. Next slide, please. Last but not the least, is that the federal government should always look for opportunities to act as a catalyst to drive additional state and local action. This is important because the federal government has considerable financial and technical resources, and as such, it is uniquely positioned to support state and local efforts. Doug Scott with Great Plains Institute actually says it much better than I can in our next video.
Before I joined the Great Plains Institute, an energy policy organization based in Minneapolis, I served 2 Illinois governors as director of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency and as chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission. Before that, I was an Illinois legislator and mayor of Rockford, Illinois. I can say firsthand that state and local governments have done a lot and want to do even more to promote sustainability and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But they need help, as they have only a fraction of the resources of the federal government. They need technical assistance to help maximize the health, economic, and resilience benefits of their programs. They need additional funding and the flexibility to direct current federal funding to more impactful programs. Consider energy efficiency, or even projects that yield quick results often stall because local government doesn't have the money to invest up front. And additional funding is particularly critical now in the wake of COVID-19, where declining revenue and increased spending on public health and economic recovery have blown holes in state and local budgets.
That actually brings me to the end of my presentation, but before I turn it over to Nicholas Bianco to moderate the panel discussion, I want to end with these thoughts. The collaborative multi-level government framework, commonly referred to as federalism, is actually not a new concept. It has been around for decades, and pretty much every policy challenge confronting our nation has benefited from some combination of federal, state, and local government involvement and responsibilities. And the repeated success of the federalism framework actually speaks to its value. So as the nation turns to address what is arguably its greatest environmental challenge yet, success really depends on embracing this model once again. Thank you. Over to you, Nicholas.
Great. Thank you, Devashri. Can you see me? You can. Okay, great. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Nicholas Bianco, and I serve as the Deputy Director for WRI-US, helping to oversee our US portfolio. I'm joined here today by 3 outstanding panelists, as you heard from Dan earlier. First, we have Secretary Katie Theoharides from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or EEA, as we abbreviated back when I was working for the state years ago. In her role, she oversees the Commonwealth's 6 environmental, natural resource, and energy regulatory agencies, and chairs the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, Energy Facility Siting Board, and Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. In addition, she chairs the group of state leaders developing the multi-state transportation climate initiative. Then we have Jeremy Tarr, who serves as the senior advisor for climate change policy for North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper. He serves as governor's designee on the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council and represents the state in the U.S. Climate Alliance. Jeremy also previously worked at US EPA. And third on our panel is Chris Castro, who is the Director of Sustainability and Resilience for Orlando and co-chair of the Future Ready Initiative. In that role, he works with the mayor and the city senior staff on the coordination, development, integration, and administration of Orlando's sustainability, energy, and climate policies and programs. So thank you all to your invaluable contributions during the dialogue and for joining us here today. For those of you on the line, what I'll do is I'll kick things off with a number of prepared questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. As you heard from Dan earlier, due to the large number of attendees today, we won't be unmuting anyone's line. So please just type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in as we go, and then we'll put them into the queue so that when we get to that portion of the event, they're on hand. Great. Maybe then the first thing to do here is to just set the stage a little bit for this conversation. I thought each of our panelists could provide a little bit of background on what you all are doing in your state or city to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Secretary Theoharis, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Well, thank you, Nicholas, Dan, and Devashree, and thanks to WRI for the important dialogue and conversation that led to this terrific report. The report couldn't come at a more critical time. Climate change certainly presents an undeniable threat to the country's residents, natural resources, economy, and quality of life. And I think that we all know that this next decade holds really the greatest possibility to reduce its impact and get us on the right course towards 2050. And to do that, we really need every level of government, federal, state, and local, to work together to meet this challenge. So the idea of, I think, cooperative federalism here really rings true for me. Here in Massachusetts, with the need to take on some of the mantle of climate leadership, given the situation at the federal level, we are and have been committed to bold, nonpartisan, bipartisan, nonpartisan, either one, climate action to address the causes and the impacts of climate change. Earlier this year, back in January, which seems like a lifetime ago at this point, Governor Baker committed the Commonwealth to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And by the end of the year, we're releasing a Massachusetts decarbonization roadmap to 2050, which will identify cost-effective and equitable strategies and implementation pathways to meet this ambitious goal. Also looking at a 10-year time frame for the actual policies we have to put in place over the next decade to set us on that course. Here in Massachusetts, as in many states across the US, transportation emissions account for over 40% of all emissions and continue to rise. And so Massachusetts has been deeply involved in working with a group of 12 states and the District of Columbia through the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI, which is facilitated by the Georgia Climate Center, in a bipartisan collaborative effort to reduce these emissions regionally, taking much of our learning from the success of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. By working together with neighboring states to accelerate this transition to a low carbon future, we're also working to deliver better, cleaner, more resilient transportation systems that benefit all communities while making significant reductions in greenhouse gases and other harmful air pollution across the region. And I know it's never been clearer, working on COVID-19 and the increased vulnerability of communities of color and low-income communities to this disease also being correlated with poor air quality, that something like this has real benefit. We're also working to provide an affordable, resilient, clean energy portfolio for Massachusetts residents. And this year we finalized the Clean Peak Energy Standard, which is a first-in-the-nation program designed to shift clean energy at times of peak energy usage and reduce energy demand at peak, which decreases both the dirtiest so-called peaker plants and decreases emissions at the same time as reducing costs for ratepayers. We've recently expanded our solar program and doubled the capacity of our incentive program. We've also procured 1,600 megawatts of locally produced offshore wind, as well as authorizing another 3,200 megawatts, and have procured over 9 million megawatt hours of clean, reliable hydropower. While we focused first on reducing contributions to climate change and building our clean energy economy, we're also working to ensure the Commonwealth is prepared for the increasing impacts of climate change like storms, sea level rise, and drought. We're actually in the middle of a drought that is getting to historic levels. It's Massachusetts, not California, so we don't look quite as brown, but we're seeing really record levels of drought this year and increased wildfire risk here in a state where we don't always see that. One of the programs we have been focused on for the last several years is our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP, which provides grants and technical assistance to municipalities so they can assess their vulnerabilities and plan for and implement priority climate change adaptation projects to build resiliency and reduce risk. It's a non-mandatory program. It's been around since 2017. And in that time, 89% of our cities and towns around the state have joined the program, which really speaks to the need to address our communities and the challenges they're seeing on the front lines of climate change. We're dedicated to continuing to invest in and partner with municipalities. We have a goal of spending $1 billion by 2022 on climate change writ large. But I think our climate programs, and the MVP program in particular, is demonstrating the scale of investments that are needed both on the mitigation and the adaptation side to cost effectively prepare for a rapidly changing climate. I think we have really seen the need for strong federal leadership and a bipartisan vision on climate change, with setting standards, ensuring a strong federal cap on emissions, and then outlining a bipartisan vision that allows states the flexibility to design strategies that work for their unique challenges while continuing to grow their economies. So look forward to the discussion and talking with my fellow panelists today about how all levels of government can work together to tackle this challenge.
Excellent. Thank you, Secretary. Jeremy, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Nicholas and Dan and others at WRI for including North Carolina in the dialogue and also on this panel today. I found it really thought-provoking and substantive to be in the room with colleagues from across the country, and that's reflected in the report. So folks that haven't had a chance to look at the report because it just came out, I'd encourage you to do so. You know, the state federal roles topic is really important for any number of issues, whether it's education, healthcare, you know, racial justice, and on. Climate change is obviously one of those important topics. So since Governor Cooper came into office in 2017, in North Carolina, we've really been working hard to turn the ship quickly in terms of positive climate action at the state level, but also speak up in opposition to the repeal and replacement over the past number of years of important federal policies and standards. As far as our state level action in North Carolina, you know, coming into office, while there was sort of a history a number of years ago of working on climate, talking about climate with the state and with stakeholders, really, in a lot of ways, we're starting from scratch. In order to get the ball rolling, Governor Cooper in 2018 set out with a wide-ranging executive order 80, that did a number of things. It set the state's first greenhouse gas reduction goals of 40% by 2025, which was well beyond the United States commitment under the Paris Agreement. So included goals for building efficiency and electric vehicle deployment. That executive order directed state agencies to develop strategic plans in key areas. So in energy, resilience, electric vehicle deployment, workforce, and state motor fleet conversion. It also established the North Carolina Interagency Climate Change Council, which was the first time we'd had a public body to discuss climate change and really hold ourselves accountable and report out to the public and hear comments from the public on what the state should be doing in terms of addressing climate mitigation and resilience. The executive order also had a general but pretty straightforward directive to all cabinet agencies, which is to consider climate mitigation and adaptation into everyday operations. The executive order really put climate change on the radar and in the minds of cabinet agencies in a way I don't think it would have been otherwise. It also helped create real momentum and among stakeholders, including businesses, advocacy groups, universities, and all. And so I think, since then we've seen a lot of momentum and folks kind of rowing in the same direction that just wasn't there before. So since that executive order, we've been busy developing these strategic plans with stakeholder engagement, and they've been very productive, those conversations. We've also been working to implement those strategies and tackle new initiatives. We have new initiatives on transit electrification. Governor Cooper signed the medium and heavy duty ZEV MOU this summer. We're moving forward on offshore wind and on and on. We have ongoing stakeholder processes to look at a handful of potential carbon policies, state level carbon policies that would make sense for North Carolina, in addition to a large stakeholder process to really look at our electricity regulatory system and to modernize the regulatory incentives in North Carolina so that they align with our 21st century policy goals, utility needs, and customer expectations. So those are big endeavors, but they're moving forward. Throughout all of this, equity and justice is a pervading theme, and throughout all of our climate actions includes, internal discussions, it includes stakeholder meetings, bilateral meetings and group meetings. It includes establishing new task forces that are focused on equity and justice. Governor Cooper established the Andrea Harris Task Force, which is focused on promoting health, economic, and environmental justice in North Carolina. Our Department of Environmental Quality also has an Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board, and these bodies have been very active. Resilience, as Secretary Theoharides mentioned, is a really important theme. It's the other side of the coin. From mitigation, we've been hit with numerous hurricanes in North Carolina. We're seeing temperature increases. We have mudslides in the west. In a recent week, we were dealing with the effects of a hurricane, earthquake, tornado at the same time, in addition to a global pandemic. So to address resilience, we have taken many steps, including establishing a new office for recovery and resilience. We have a Chief Resilience Officer, Dr. Jessica Whitehead, who's been in place for 18 months or so now. We have an interagency resilience team, which is a place where agency leadership that are focused on resilience can interact and share best practices and develop cross-cutting solutions and a mutual venue that meets on a regular basis. And we also just recently launched the North Carolina Resilient Communities Program, which is designed to train and support local governments and regional and regions of the state and their resilience planning. So we feel like we're doing our part at the state level. There's more that we need to do, more to come, but we need federal action. We need a federal partner for the reasons that Devashree mentioned earlier, and I'm sure we'll continue discussing on this panel. But we're ready to work constructively with the federal government on both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and protecting our states and our residents from the impacts of climate change.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Chris, do you want to say a little bit about what you're doing in Orlando?
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. And it's quite inspiring to hear what states like North Carolina and Massachusetts are doing on this topic. I wish I was able to say the same for Florida, but good news is local governments in Florida are stepping up significantly. My name is Chris Castro. I'm with the City of Orlando, and I have the honor and privilege of being the senior advisor to our mayor, Buddy Dyer, as well as the director of our Office of Sustainability and Resilience. And over the last 6 years, helping to lead our climate and sustainability initiatives wholeheartedly, both internally and externally at the city. Orlando, even our state of Florida, is a beautiful place. For those who have visited, I think you'd also realize, but it's not one that comes to mind for most when you think of leadership in sustainability and climate action. You might think of us being premier sports destination or great for entertainment and Mickey Mouse and fire-breathing dragons, but I'm here to share that there's a completely different side of the city that most people don't get to hear about, and that is our leadership in moving us as a model for urban sustainability and climate action. Greenworks Orlando is essentially our initiative, the brand of our initiative that we've been leading since 2007 here, and focuses on making bold and daring moves to transition us in a more environmentally friendly, socially inclusive, and equitable and economically vibrant way. We've been early signatories of the Global Covenant of Mayors of Climate and Energy and the Under 2 MOU shortly after Paris, sit on the steering committee for the Climate Mayors Network, and are part of more than a dozen networks of cities and local governments that are working together to identify the policy and program framework that we need to advance solutions to the climate emergency. Ultimately, our initiative has become both an internal sustainability and resiliency consulting firm. That's one of the easiest ways that I describe what we do, looking both internally at city operations as well as the entire community, and supporting our utility, our transit authority, our schools and universities, our business community, and all the way down to our residents, and helping them make the switch towards sustainability. A couple of things I wanted to highlight is obviously our focus on climate action revolves on a number of a multi-pronged approach. One is ramping up building efficiency and focus on demand side energy efficiency. We've done a lot with enabling municipal green bonds to retrofit our own city buildings, enabling policies that actually require the private sector to perform annual energy and water benchmarks, energy audits, and provide transparency of that information, enabling clean energy capital and financing like SELF and PACE programs, and even started to work with our municipal utility on some on-bill financing retrofit programs for residential and soon to be commercial and multifamily buildings. Secondly, we're really focused on, as we own and operate our own municipal electric and water utility, decarbonizing that utility and ramping up renewables significantly. We're doing a lot with obviously rooftop solar on city property right now, over 1.5 megawatts of rooftop solar in development as we speak, but also looking at our parking lots and having solar canopies, ground mounted larger scale utility solar farms. We're hosting solar co-ops, group buying programs for our residents, and we're even starting to install solar on our lake bodies and retention pond water bodies, photovoltaics, and the floating solar solutions. We see that vehicle electrification is critical, and so we are focused on switching not only the city's fleet, but the entire public transportation fleet to electric and alternative fuel by 2030. We've been investing our own public capital in expanding EV charging infrastructure and launching some unique behavioral programs that are aiming to ramp up the adoption of electric vehicles, things like ongoing ride and drive events, as well as an electrified dealership program to incentivize vehicle dealerships to begin selling more EVs. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention natural climate solutions and the fact that in addition to this technology that's ramping down with renewables and efficiency, we also see the importance of working with nature and incorporating cities' nature within our city. And so robust urban forestry programs, we provide thousands of free trees per year to our residents, and ultimately are striving to achieve a 40% tree canopy by the year 2040. And across all of these things I've just talked about, ensuring that we promote equitable and healthy outcomes for our residents, always being center, and especially those disproportionately impacted, such as communities of color and those of low-income communities throughout the city. So that's a little bit about some of the work that we're doing, and I look forward to diving into more detail on the panel.
Great, that was excellent, thank you. I'm always struck by how much more is actually happening on the ground across the country when I talk to state and local leaders than oftentimes even makes the headlines here in DC. And given, I guess, all that you're doing, I guess it would be really helpful to get your thoughts on why exactly we need the federal government in the game, and maybe some fairly short responses, because we could do a couple rapid fire questions on some of these higher level questions. And Chris, do you want to give an initial response to that one?
Sure. I mean, I think the federal government, all levels of government play critical roles, as we're well aware and articulated in this new resource. They're all critical in advancing climate solutions. And I think from a federal standpoint, there's opportunities to help set minimum floors, help provide market assurance in terms of where things are headed and setting bold and ambitious goals of where we should be leading. And ultimately, providing funding to state and local governments to help drive the necessary investments in clean energy that we need to build back our economy and for us to scale back and continue to advance the clean energy movement that we're seeing.
Excellent. Jeremy, did you want to come in on this?
Sure. I mean, I agree with what's been said before, that we need federal goals and standards that are sufficient to address climate change, but also allow states to go further and tailor implementation consistent with local circumstances and values. I think, one of the things that we need from the federal government is strong emission reduction targets past 2025 out to mid-century. The task at hand of getting to carbon neutral economy, it's just too big to achieve with individual state action or action by half the countries, say, the 25 Climate Alliance states. It's really hard to see a recipe for success being each of the 50 states individually and on their own timeline committing to carbon neutrality and implementing those commitments, even with pockets of regional cooperation and multi-state programs. So federal targets are extremely important. They're important for international negotiations. When we set targets, it will help other countries make stronger commitments than they would otherwise. When the federal government sets targets, it is helpful domestically as well. It can kind of set the vision and the end goal of ambition for states and help drive the conversation. And that would help drive conversation in some states and provide a floor in other states. In addition to setting targets, strong federal policies and standards to back them up are important as well. It's one thing to have goals, another thing to go to international negotiations, not just with targets, but with policies that show that they're substantiated and achievable. Those kinds of targets would help, or policies would help set a level playing field across states. Currently, we have wide differences in the ambition and types of policies that different states have. And those types of federal standards and policies would help drive state action across the country that we need. They're great first mover states that are proactive and aggressive on climate. Those states get a lot of attention, and for good reason. Their leadership's needed. There's maybe second mover states who move forward voluntarily, but on a different time scale. But there's I think a third category of states who will move forward willingly when required to do so. I think about the Clean Power Plan days where there were a number of states whose air directors, air offices, or utilities commissioners were very active in learning and thinking about climate policy for the power sector. But we haven't really heard much from those states in terms of climate action since then. So just an example of when the federal government sets targets and sets standards, that there are really smart people who are motivated in states to move forward on them, even if there isn't the political leadership there to speak up voluntarily and ignite that kind of action on their own. I think there are other categories that have been mentioned as far as the importance of federal funding and technical support that we may get into, but suffice it to say, I think there's wide range of opportunities for the federal government to lead on climate action.
Thank you. So let's do another rapid fire question. Let's talk preemption. This term gets tossed around all the time here in Washington, D.C., and some really consider it to be the currency for any major federal program. What do you all think of this? Is that good policy? If not, then why not? What do you lose? Jeremy, do you want to start and then maybe turn over to the secretary?
Yeah, I think echo some of the themes that have come up before. I mean, federal action, it can credit existing state efforts and allow states to go tighter when they determine so. I think so, not preempting in that sense. Allowing states to start new programs so that we all get the benefit of states pioneering new programs and that could be replicated in other states or by the federal government makes a lot of sense. Giving states a reasonable degree of autonomy and flexibility when it comes to implementing federal targets or programs. That could be interim targets or stakeholder engagement. That's another, I think, value or theme that comes up in terms of preemption. I guess I'll also say another reason to not preempt state action is that when states continue to feel ownership over climate action, it can really help the country and businesses move forward to reducing emissions despite swings in federal political leadership across the past two administrations. I think state action and local action has been consistent, and so we wouldn't want to lose that momentum, because it would be hard to regain that if federal action sort of comes and goes in the future.
Yeah, I just add this really only comes into play, where state and federal law conflict. And so I think that if we have a federal government that's committed to decarbonization, it should rarely preempt a state like Massachusetts or North Carolina or California, who are already committed and working aggressively in the direction. And I think Chris made the comment before, we want a floor, not a ceiling. And so I think that certainly rings true to me here. We need a federal government that is setting strong minimum federal standards, above which states can apply more stringent requirements that don't conflict. I think, to pick up on Jeremy's point about policy flexibility for states to design solutions, states and locals are really the implementers and the executors of a lot of these goals and policies. And I think giving states and municipalities the flexibility to design solutions that ultimately hit a strong standard or a strong federal target opens up a lot of creativity, innovation, and healthy competition, frankly, amongst communities. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen at the state level is when we began to implement our resiliency program, there were a number of communities who had gone out in front of us, including the city of Boston and Cambridge and a number of coastal communities. And we didn't want to, take away the work that they had done to become resilient cities. In fact, we wanted to expand on it and make it accessible to communities across the state. And so what we did in that case was design a really flexible framework with a set of minimum criteria that cities and towns had to meet. And so I think that's sort of the cooperative federalism that I think really appeals to us on climate change, where there's a role for partnership and there's learning that goes between all levels of government. And then I think the feds can really act as a very strong backstop. We absolutely need federal standards, and we absolutely need the types of investments and the pulling the ship in the right direction. I think you look at what the federal government's been able to do in times when there was something big we needed to accomplish, whether it was getting a man on the moon or coming out of the Depression or handling any of the world wars we've been involved in. This is something that if federal leadership was all pulling in the direction with states and cities and towns, we would make significant progress.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to bring you on this question, Chris. Federal preemption isn't really come up in quite that same way for local governments, but it doesn't mean that you don't get left on the sidelines by federal programs or even preempted by state legislatures at times. Do you want to talk just a little bit about why you think, in broad terms, why local governments are essential and what's lost if they're not brought in as partners?
Yeah, I think, what Katie was alluding to in terms of this kind of a fluid and ongoing dialogue between local, state, and federal is absolutely critical. And as you're alluding to, Nicholas, we don't normally, we are dealing with preemption issues from state legislature trying to strip home rule from our city's ability to take action on something, right? We've seen this with the lack of third-party sale of electricity, so no third-party PPAs, one of the most popular ways people invest in renewables. They've even started to strip back our ability to protect the urban forest, and just this past legislative session, put forward a major preemption that is having us to question whether our tree protection ordinance is legally sound. And so this is an ongoing concern, and I think ultimately what WRI, this resource outlines that I think is a strong takeaway is this notion of preemption is rare and should be rare and shouldn't happen on a regular basis. And the actions from federal and I would say even state governments should enable and not restrict or impede the actions of the additional, governments to go above and beyond what that floor is, right? Set that standard, set the science-based target, and allow us to be able to use innovation, to Katie's point, to go above and beyond that and not impede our ability to exceed it.
Great. So that was really helpful. Thank you. So I thought we might just shift a little bit to discussion of some very specific federal policies that we've seen discussions on in this Congress, where preemption, I think, frequently comes up. First being carbon pricing, and I think is certainly what the entire panel knows, but as many of the audience members know, this could take very different forms at the federal level, whether we're talking about a cap and trade program, a carbon tax. I think there is a frequent question as to how any federal program should intersect with those existing state programs, like the one Massachusetts has had in place for the power sector since 2009, and like it's working on with others in the Northeast through the Transportation Climate Initiative. Secretary Theoharis, you're chairing that regional effort. So I think it'd be really great to get some of your thoughts on this question. How do you think these state and regional carbon pricing programs should interact with any future federal program? Are there certain roles that should remain?
As you mentioned, Nicholas, we have in Massachusetts the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We're working hard to set up a cap and invest through the Transportation Climate Initiative, and then we have an in-state market for electric generating units on top of that. So a couple of really active markets. And I think while we value these regional and state carbon markets, and they're absolutely essential, and we have an in-state target obviously to hit, we believe that the federal government has to get in on this action in carbon markets across the US to level the playing field, to ensure all states are contributing to market-driven emission reductions, and to create the larger market that comes along with that. And so in this case, if the federal government is setting a more stringent or a higher price, then there really is no issue. If it's setting a minimum price that states can choose to be above, so in this case not preempting, but backstopping, then again, we don't see any issue with that, and it would come with a benefit of that larger market, and obviously larger emission reductions. I say this sometimes, and occasionally it gets picked up the wrong way, but our emission reductions in Massachusetts don't matter, on the scale that the US emission reductions matter. And so our role on emission reductions is modeling good policy solutions, developing technology and innovation, helping to show how you can do procurements of clean, renewable energy. But if that's all we did and we stopped there and we said, hey, we're happy with our regional stuff, we're happy with our state markets, we don't need the feds, leave us alone, we'd really be missing the boat here, because we're 1% of US emissions. But the other benefit that I think in the role that WRI pointed out in the report that is can't be undersold is the role that the feds can play here in terms of setting up the infrastructure to run a program like this. I mean, as we continue discussions on getting to our regional market through the Transportation Climate Initiative, one of the things is then we have to set up a regional body to oversee it, to monitor it, to do reporting, to do the emissions tracking and all of that, and that costs money and takes time. And so those are other pieces that the federal government is really well set up to put into place to support a nationwide program like this. And I think any type of program like this risks, if it's taken to the federal level, it risks sucking up money that has been available to states and has been very important for states that have these markets. And so that is something that I think would need to be really carefully considered to continue to have states really directing a large part of the investments with their municipalities. That's been something that is so critical through TCI, is that while the the market is regional. The investments coming into each state are decided on by each state, working with their stakeholders and their cities and towns. And I do think that's a key piece where care would need to be taken so that the vast majority of the funds collected by a federal program would be directed essentially by states and locals. And I think a piece there that's important, certainly to this group on the call and the states and TCI, is that ensuring equity in program design for carbon markets is a theme that's certainly being discussed a lot lately. I think carbon markets have been criticized for not delivering sort of geographically specific benefits, and you called this out in the report as well. And so ensuring that investments are delivered to environmental justice communities, to overburdened communities by reducing emissions in specific locations, or investing to ensure that air quality is improving, and actually doing monitoring to ensure that air quality is improving is another piece that I think states and localities working within these federal markets are really well set up to deploy.
Nicholas, I'd just emphasize a couple points. Secretary, your point about allowing states flexibility to invest proceeds in ways that make sense for them, want to emphasize the importance of that. In addition, Nicholas, you mentioned that these types of carbon markets could be designed in various ways. To the extent states have flexibility on design elements of the policy. So if states have choices on how to design the carbon market policies, whether a lot of discretion or a little bit of discretion, support from the federal government in terms of funding and technical support to help states analyze the impacts of those choices would be very valuable. It would be valuable so that states can be confident they're making the right choice for their state on how to design and implement the policy. It can also be really helpful for stakeholders to understand what the impacts of a policy choice would be or would not be. So to dispel myths, but also promote accurate information that helps with buy-in among not just state officials, but stakeholders as well. We're really finding this to be the case through the carbon policy analysis that I mentioned earlier, where the Nicholas Institute at Duke University is facilitating a fairly large stakeholder process to help us look at a handful of policies to see if they make sense for North Carolina, including a multi-state carbon market, coal retirements on a certain schedule, and having a carbon adder through IRP or utility commission proceedings. Each of these policies, individually or in combination, will have different impacts for the state. So support from the federal government for states to do the analysis that they need to make the right design choices would be very valuable.
And one quick point to piggyback on that, I think trickling down to the cities, there's an opportunity here for the local governments within these states to support the program design with our state governments, right? So as states are engaging at the federal level, they're coming with input and feedback in terms of how we could pragmatically deploy certain resources to achieve our ultimate goals. So I think across the board, whether it's carbon pricing or setting these standards, this important collaboration from local, state, and federal, I think is going to be essential for whatever we move forward. And the more that we can continue to weave in that process and procedure, I think the less people will be felt left out of the conversation and more take ownership of the decision that ends up moving forward.
Great, thanks. So let's do another one of these. So transportation is now the largest source of US greenhouse gas emissions. This administration just is recently moved rules to roll back the emission standards for passenger cars and light trucks while simultaneously revoking the waiver that lets California and other states establish more ambitious standards. Just, Secretary, as chair of the TCI, as I mentioned, I assume you've given a lot of thought to what the right structure is here, what role states should have, and how we should work together to decarbonize the sector.
I think if you look to Europe, every state that's serious about meeting the IPCC's mid-century emissions reductions target is federally regulating auto manufacturers to require performance by a date certain. That ensures that the manufacturers retool and reinvest rather than simply paying fines, and the same thing really needs to be happening here. We are confident that the right of California and the 177 states to set vehicle emission standards will be upheld. And these just have been essential for Massachusetts, and I know for the other states. Vehicle emission standards they've been a critical tool to transition our vehicle fleet to cleaner vehicles, and the leadership of California and these other states, including Massachusetts, has been a driving force behind making these programs ambitious and successful. And we've, one of the few places we've seen emission reductions in this sector has come from these standards. So we'll continue to work with California and the federal government on post-2025 standards. We believe it's critical that post-2025 standards must be consistent with the need to achieve the legally binding emission reductions in both Massachusetts and California. So the standards absolutely need to be consistent. And I think the recent proposal by Governor Newsom last week, the week before, time has become a sort of an irrelevant thing lately, but to accelerate those emission standards until all new passenger vehicles are electric by 2035 is a good starting point on what will be, sort of a negotiation between states and the federal government over the next few years. I think at the same time, we certainly recognize that these standards alone are not enough to make the transition happen. Neither is a cap on emissions in the sector. And so at the state level, we also need to provide incentives and support for electric vehicle infrastructure and help people be able to make that transition. So you're not pulling the rug out from under people's feet by making things too expensive. You're actually paving the way, literally, for everyone to get there. And so this is why, for us, the Transportation Climate Initiative and the investments in clean transportation are so important, because they'll make it possible for states here in the Northeast to transition. And so the Cap and Invest program under TCI would provide that funding, somewhere on the order of $500 million annually just in Massachusetts, to invest in our transportation system with the goal of reducing pollution and increasing economic development, increasing resiliency of the transit system, and then promoting equity and providing benefits to lower income and to rural communities. And I think, just today, Harvard released their sort of much anticipated public health study using the scenarios developed through the Transportation Climate Initiative. And they found that by cleaning up air pollution, making our streets safer and more walkable, and enabling healthier forms of active transportation, TCI is projected over the 10-year period to generate annual benefits of $11.1 million by 2032. It's reducing asthma cases close to 5,000, childhood asthma cases, as well as 1,100 premature deaths. And so this sector is critical. There's not one silver bullet, and we have to pursue a number of policies, but federal standards, cap and invest, and certainly investment in our infrastructure are really key.
Great. And one of the things that you touched a little bit on there, Secretary, is the importance of having the right infrastructure to support the transition. And that's something that I know you're doing a lot of in Orlando. Chris, do you want to just say a little bit about how you see the unique role of local governments and what the federal government should be doing or thinking about in order to help support and strengthen those efforts?
Yeah, so, transportation sector emissions have now exceeded electricity generation as of recent and become kind of one of the biggest sources of our carbon footprint in this country. And so it's becoming more and more of a concern. And obviously the current administration's approach is a shining example of what we don't want to see, kind of the rollbacks of those standards and then preemption of governments like California and others to not go above and beyond. And so that's concerning, but it's something that, you know, quite frankly, we're kind of used to in Orlando, not having that form of leadership at the state level to rely on. And as the mayor often says, Mayor Dyer often says, be the tip of the spear as it relates to this and charge on, right? Our local university is UCF and our slogan is charge on. So we often say that. And I'll say that, you know, from an infrastructure standpoint, we're in the process of deploying about $1 million worth of level 2 infrastructure throughout the city at parks, at rec centers, parking garages, and even on-street parking. This is an investment that we're making on behalf and in partnership with our municipal utility. And I think utilities are going to play a pretty important role in helping to enable that infrastructure, quite frankly, because it's a market driver for their commodity and selling electricity, and helps us to wean off of you know, raw fossil fuels that we're trying to move towards. So as I mentioned, we've made a commitment to transition our public fleet and buses to 100% electric and alternative fuel by 2030. And in fact, this month, launching our first fleet of electric buses in our BRT for downtown Orlando, which is super exciting, something we played a big role in. How we got to that point is some federal government support. So I think enabling and enhancing more of the low-no emission grants that are being provided by FTA and USDOT have been an incredible catalyst to spur local electrification efforts for transit. And I think being able to enhance that further, I think is going to be play a pretty significant role. And then lastly, we're now working with the state on looking at emergency evacuation corridors for those in electric vehicles trying to flee from a major hurricane or storm event coming to Florida. And so you might have heard that the governor signed a bill to create the first electric vehicle roadmap in Florida, identifying the state highway systems and where we might need to land DC fast throughout the state. And in addition, we received a small grant from that to establish the first DC charging hub in downtown Orlando, a fleet of about 22 chargers that are going to be right there, right off of I-4, and again, a major emergency evacuation corridor. So I think the collaboration across all those levels are really important to spur this, and local governments are in the driver's seat, pun intended, to really support the infrastructure, support programming around rebates and behavioral changes, and also do our own part to lead by example in transitioning our own public fleet in a cleaner direction.
Great. So I want to quickly turn to a couple of questions that have come in during this session, both of which relate to adaptation and resilience planning, which I think actually at this point all of you have touched on at some level thus far. The two, though, I think specific questions that have come in are, one, what's the right approach in a federalism context? So what should each level of government be doing ideally, and what can, I think, therefore the feds do also to help support your efforts at the state and local level? What are the sort of technical needs specifically that would be most valuable?
One of the things that we're seeing is, you know, we said it on the mitigation side, but having federal funds are critical for state and local government resilience planning. With having had multiple hurricanes, 3 500-year floods in the past, you know, dozen or so years, you know, our coastal communities are really focused on rebuilding smarter and stronger, and incorporating climate change into their long-term resilience planning. Some of the CDBG PR planning funds can be used for long-term resilience planning, the CDBG MIT funds as well, and some of the BRIC funding that's coming down are really all opportunities that we're looking at and taking advantage of to be proactive in our long-term resilience planning, including nature-based solutions like Chris mentioned earlier, and not just be in a responsive posture disaster after disaster. So more federal funding with you know, allowing states flexibility to use those funds for planning and for projects would be very helpful. I guess the second thing I'll say is on a technical aspect, I mean, for each sector, it's say transportation. It's one thing to say we should have a more resilient transportation infrastructure. It's another thing for the engineers to have the actual design parameters and analysis that they need in order to incorporate resilience into how they build bridges, where they build bridges and roads, what type of materials, how high, what alternatives are. In order to go through all of that, it's not just a values issue, it's a needing technical analysis and support. And the type of analysis that North Carolina big transportation officials need, and this could be the same for power sector, healthcare, other sectors, I venture are very similar to what Florida or Orlando or Massachusetts, experts and their DOTs need. So I think there's opportunity for federal government to really lean in and provide the types of analysis and technical support that would be helpful to multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jeremy, and I think we saw in the transition on the federal side a sudden loss in some of the federal resources that we were used to using, whether it was downscale climate data, adaptation best practices, or something I was involved in when I worked in DC actually was all of the state agencies, all of the federal agencies doing climate adaptation planning and beginning to incorporate climate adaptation into everything they're doing, whether it's climate related or not. And we took that approach at the state level of just incorporating climate considerations and concerns and impacts across state government, environmental or infrastructure or economic development. But the model that those plans could continue to provide if they still existed, and then the translation of those plans into design standards, particularly for large infrastructure projects, for roads and bridges, is just so critical to have that leadership at the federal level. We've actually taken it on ourselves as a state to develop, state and county and watershed level climate data, and then to downscale it, and then to turn it into resiliency standards for vertical projects, for horizontal projects as well. But that's taken us 4 or 5 years, and for every state to have to do that, sort of on their own is just a waste of time and resources. It's great for us. It's built a lot of local trust in the data, but we need the federal agencies to really play a much more vocal and proactive role on providing the science and data that they always have in that arena until recently. I think the other thing I'd say is that there's a number of sort of key federal processes where climate adaptation has to come more into play, whether it's the National Flood Insurance Program, looking at coastal buyback programs, NEPA. So, just things on the federal side where without that federal leadership, I think the decisions become increasingly difficult for states and locals without some role for the feds there.
Thank you. So one of the themes that touched on a little bit on the technical support theme. Are there other technical support items that you need at the state or local level from the federal government to help you as you implement programs?
Well, Nicholas, I have a good example of how we've leaned on technical assistance from not the federal government, but the philanthropic community. So since 2014, the city of Orlando has been working closely with philanthropy, primarily Bloomberg Philanthropies, Kresge, Doris Duke, Energy Foundation, and many others that have really stepped up to support local governments in this time of inaction at the federal level. And one of the things that we've seen really help build capacity within local government to address this crisis is them stepping into one offset cost for technical experts within our cities. So we've been able to get climate advisors, as an example, through the American Cities Climate Challenge for a 2-year period to help us to think through the policy and program elements that we need to deepen our climate commitments. And what that has done is it helps prove the importance of having technical experts like that within city government, and have allowed me to add capacity to my office just this fiscal year. Even in times of this uncertainty, we've been able to hire a full-time climate advisor coming from, off of the heels of this 2-year effort from the American Cities Climate Challenge. I think that there, in addition to the technical assistance of the individual, there's also been coupled with funding support for local community-based organizations to begin incorporating the community's input to our work and addressing equity head-on with some of these groups. And I think that has been really important. So technical and financial support from philanthropy has been critical. And I can only imagine if we had a federal government program that did something similar, that helped support states and local governments in adding the capacity that often is a risk for governments to hire in the public realm, and be able to de-risk from their support and deepen the work that we're doing at the state and local level.
Yeah, another piece there on the clean energy front is, the expertise of the federal government, particularly the work of the national labs. And so the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, ARPA-E, really stand out, as does the EPA in terms of its work on science-based regulatory standards. I think especially in this case, GHG emissions accounting, that's something the U.S. Climate Alliance has really picked up. How do we work with states who have an emissions inventory to help other states who don't pick that up? But that used to be more of a function of EPA.
Really good point, Katie. And I just wanted to share that we are just finishing up a relationship with NREL on doing a distributed generation model, so a DGen model for rooftop solar adoption, and incorporating that into our integrated resources plan. And that's something that we were able to incorporate into the overall contract in doing that plan. But the collaboration across the 17 national labs has been really critical, and even your state clean energy efforts. NC Clean Energy Research Center is amazing. The Florida Solar Energy Center down here in Florida, and I know many others across the state, including up in Massachusetts, where we're relying on that needed technical assistance to support us in making the right decision and the right investment.
Right.
So I want to get one more question from the audience in here before we wrap up. Secretary, you mentioned earlier in your comments on carbon pricing, the value of I think the states having a role and local governments having a role in the use of any proceeds that are raised by a federal program. One of the things that I think we've seen with programs thus far is that states have had different priorities at different times. Sometimes it's investing in areas things that can help transition communities, reduce emissions, help support the investment in clean energy, and in other cases, helping to offset budget deficits. In the event that some of those funds are coming through a federal program, should there be any constraints that are provided to or imposed on state and local governments in terms of how those funds are used?
Yeah, I mean, I think there should be flexibility within certain agreed upon bounds, and that's the way the states have been discussing the Transportation Climate Initiative, for example, is a couple of major buckets, making sure the proceeds go towards investments in GHG reduction, towards improving options for underserved communities who don't have access to safe transportation. And then we have just made a very strong commitment to ensuring equity through the program design. And so states have committed that at least 35% of the proceeds would go to overburdened and underserved communities. So these are our principles. The way we implement that has a lot of flexibility attached to it, but I think the idea that states might be able to sweep a fund like this for non-transportation, non-climate related investments is something that would be worrisome to folks who are trying to work on climate solutions, equity solutions, and transportation solutions through this program. So I think there should be safeguards on ensuring that the funding is targeted to the places where it can advance the solutions that it's intended to deliver. But I think that's an important point, and that may look different based on the state. It may not be that there's a federal backstop on it. It may be that there's state-specific implementation of that, and I think some of that's okay. But the intent should be to ensure that the funding is used for the purpose it's called for.
Great. Thank you. So,
and I just wanted to quickly add there that I think that there are models that have really worked and shown and proven to be successful. I think immediately during the Recovery Act with the energy efficiency and conservation block grants that had specific funding for state and local governments, that had a frame around what you could invest and use that money for, but ultimately, quite frankly, catalyzed a lot of the clean energy movement we've seen over the last decade. And so I think there's an opportunity there to relook at how we administered that effort, maybe broaden it to also incorporate climate adaptation strategies, but make sure that it still fits within the overall objective of addressing the climate crisis.
And there's a way, I think, there's a way to address these multiple goals often with these programs, whether it's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the economic stimulus in 2010, or TCI. We're going to come out of a period with an economic recession, depression from the pandemic, and the investments that we're making after that to stimulate the economy don't have to just stimulate the economy. They can be investments in a clean transportation system, investments in resilient infrastructure, investments in clean energy. And so the program proceeds don't have to just have one goal, but they should make sure they deliver on the primary goal of moving the needle on climate change.
great. I think that's about all the time we have for today, since we're at the bottom of the hour. I'd like to thank our panelists, our video contributors, and all the participants in the Federalism Dialogue. I'd also like to thank the project team at WRI that includes Dan and Devashree, who you heard from earlier, as well as Tyler Clevenger. I want to thank Matt Herbert for his communications and event support, and want to recognize the invaluable contributions of Franz Litz of Litz Energy Strategies. He's been supporting state and climate and energy policy efforts for a long time now, and it was a privilege to be able to work with him on this. And in parting then to the audience, I'll just say that you can visit WRI.org for a copy of the report and a recording of this webinar sometime later this week, as well as a list of the principles that we discussed earlier. So thank you for joining.